It started like any other Saturday night. I had just transferred to this small town college, and people said I needed to go make friends. Get out there. So when the guy from my psych class, Brian, invited me to a house party on Ashwood Drive, I figured, why not? The house was old, one of those classic Victorian homes converted into student housing, the kind of place that felt like it had its own secrets. It was massive, with creaking wooden floors and a faint smell of mildew that the beer and sweat couldn't quite mask. The place was packed, music thumping, so loud you can feel it in your chest. People spilled into the narrow hallways, red solo cups in hand, while others crammed into dimly lit rooms playing drinking games. I didn't know many people, so I stuck close to Brian and his friends. I remember walking through the house, my eyes drifting to the peeling wallpaper and the strange, mismatched furniture. A few doors were locked, which seemed odd in a house full of college students. At one point, Brian leaned over and said, "Stay out of the basement. The landlord's super weird about it." He laughed, like it was some kind of running joke. They say someone died down there. But hey, that's just part of the charm, right? I chuckled nervously and tried to play it off, but the way he said it, the casual tone, the slight edge of unease, stuck with me. Around midnight, the crowd started thinning out, and I felt more comfortable wandering around alone. I ended up in the kitchen, where a group of girls were gossiping. One of them, a petite blonde named Kara, mentioned the basement. "You guys know about that girl, right?" she said, lowering her voice. "The one who disappeared? She lived here, like 10 years ago. They never found her body." Her friends laughed it off, but something about her expression felt too serious. I asked her what happened, and she shrugged. "They say she was the last one seen going downstairs during a party. Some people think she never left. The landlord sealed it up after that." I should have walked away, should have ignored it, but the combination of alcohol, curiosity, and the eerie house had me hooked. The door to the basement was in the back of the house, near the laundry room. When I found it, it was padlocked, just like they said. But here's the thing. The padlock wasn't latched. It hung there, loose, as if someone forgot to lock it. I hesitated opening it, but then against my better judgment, I opened the door. The smell hit me first, a damp, earthy stench that made my stomach turn. The stairs were narrow and steep, creaking under my weight as I descended. The only light came from a single, bare bulb swinging overhead. The basement was mostly empty, except for an old wooden table and a few rusted tools scattered on the floor. But in the corner, there was a door. A small, metal door with scratches along its surface, as if something or someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. I walked closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The air grew colder, and the smell intensified, making it hard to breathe. That's when I saw it. Dark stains on the floor leading to the door. They were old, but unmistakable. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Before I could touch it, I heard a noise behind me, a faint whisper. "Help me." I spun around, my heart in my throat. The basement was empty. At least it looked empty. But then I saw something, a shadow in the corner, darker than the rest. It moved, shifting unnaturally, as if it didn't belong to anything. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow stretched, and then I saw it. A face, pale and distorted, emerging from the darkness. Eyes hollow, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. I bolted back up the stairs, tripping and scraping my knees on the splintered wood. The door slammed shut behind me, the padlock clicking into place on its own. I ran back into the party, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. I tried to tell Brian, but he just laughed. "Dude, you've had too much to drink. Relax." But I couldn't. I left the party and never went back. A week later, I heard on campus that Kara, the girl who told me about the basement, had gone missing. No one seemed to know what happened to her. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there hadn't finished his business yet. Whatever I had almost unleashed was waiting, and it wasn't done taking people. Now every time I pass by Ashwood Drive, I speed up. The house still stands there, dark and empty. They say the landlord can't keep tenants for too long. And sometimes, if you walk past at night, you can hear faint whispers coming from the basement. It was supposed to be a night to remember. Kyle's parents were out of town, and his house, tucked away at the end of Ridgewood Lane, was the perfect place for a party. The house was massive, a sprawling ranch with dark wood paneling, an overgrown backyard, and a driveway that seemed to stretch on forever. The kind of place that felt isolated, even though it wasn't far from the main road. Kyle had practically invited the entire senior class, and by 10 p.m., the house was packed. Music blasted from a Bluetooth speaker in the living room. People danced, and the smell of cheap alcohol mixed with sweat and perfume filled the air. Everyone seemed to be having the time of their lives. Everyone except me. I wasn't much of a partier, but my best friend Rachel had begged me to come. "Come on, Mia. It'll be fun. Besides, Kyle's house is creepy in the coolest way." Rachel was right about one thing. The house was creepy. Something about it felt off, even when we first arrived. The walls were covered with old, faded family photos, and the dim lighting cast long, eerie shadows in the hallways. By midnight, most of the partygoers were either drunk, passed out, or hanging out in the backyard around the fire pit. Rachel and I were in the kitchen pouring drinks when I noticed him, a man standing in the far corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't someone from our school. That much was obvious. He looked older, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and he was just watching, not drinking, not talking to anyone, just standing there, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. "Do you know that guy?" I asked Rachel, nodding toward him. "No clue. Probably one of Kyle's cousins or something." She waved it off, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. Over the next hour, we kept noticing him. No matter where we went, the living room, the backyard, the hallway, he was always there, always in the background, always watching. At one point, I finally nudged Kyle, who was drunkenly trying to set up a game of beer pong. "Hey Kyle, who's that guy in the hoodie?" Kyle frowned, looking around. "What guy?" I turned to point him out, but he wasn't there. "Never mind." Later, Rachel and I went upstairs to find an empty room where we could sit and talk. The upstairs hallway was long and dark, the only light coming from a single bulb flickering above us. We ended up in Kyle's parents' bedroom, a massive space with a 4-poster bed and heavy curtains that made the room feel suffocating. Rachel flopped onto the bed, laughing about something, while I sat in a chair near the window, staring out into the darkness. That's when I saw him again. He was standing in the backyard, near the tree line, motionless. Even from the second floor, I could see the pale outline of his face, and my stomach dropped. Rachel, he's out there, right now. She sat up, her smile fading. Who? The guy in the hoodie. He's outside. Rachel walked over to the window and peered out. Mia, there's no one there. I stood up, gripping her arm. I'm not imagining this. He's been watching me all night. Rachel rolled her eyes. Okay, let's go downstairs and find Kyle. We'll figure out who he is. Reluctantly, I followed her. The party had died down now. Only a handful of people were still there, sprawled on couches or sitting around the fire pit. Kyle was nowhere to be found. Maybe he's upstairs, Rachel said. As we climbed up the staircase, the house seemed quieter than before. The only sound the creak of the wooden steps under our feet. When we reached the top, the hallway was pitch black. Kyle? Rachel called out, her voice echoing. That's when we heard it. A soft thud coming from one of the bedrooms. Rachel grabbed my hand. Let's just check it out, okay? I didn't want to. She was already pushing open the door to Kyle's little brother's room. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. And on the floor in the middle of the room was Kyle's phone. Rachel picked it up, her face pale. This doesn't make sense. He wouldn't leave without his phone. A low creak sounded behind us. We spun around, and there he was, the man in the hoodie, standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. Run! I screamed, grabbing Rachel's arm and yanking her past him. We bolted down the stairs, our footsteps thunderous, but he didn't follow. When we reached the front door, we turned back to look, and he was still there, standing at the top of the staircase, his head tilted, as if he were studying us. The last thing I saw before we ran outside was the glint of something metallic in his hand. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the house was empty. No Kyle, no man in the hoodie. A week later, they found Kyle's body in the woods behind the house. His neck had been broken, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. They never found the man in the hoodie. But sometimes, I dream about him, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, and I wonder if he's still out there, looking for his next victim. The night after graduation felt like a dream. Everyone was buzzing, excited about the future, nostalgic about what we were leaving behind. Madison's house was the perfect spot for a party. Her family owned this old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and woods that stretched for miles. The place was huge, creaky floors, peeling white paint, and a backyard that seemed to disappear into the trees. By 11 p.m., the party was in full swing. Someone had hooked up a massive speaker on the porch, blasting music into the night. People danced under the string lights Madison had strung up earlier that day. Inside, the kitchen was crowded with people making terrible mixed drinks. And upstairs, groups were crammed into every bedroom doing God knows what. I wasn't much for the chaos, so I stayed mostly in the living room, nursing a beer and laughing with my best friends, Jordan and Becca. The vibe was perfect, nostalgic, bittersweet, and just chaotic enough to feel like a proper send-off. Then Jake showed up. Jake wasn't invited. He wasn't even a part of our class. He graduated a couple of years ahead of us, but he was infamous in our small town. The guy was trouble. Rumors about fights, drugs, and even a stint in juvie followed him like a shadow. When he walked in, the energy in the room shifted. He was tall, with dark eyes that seemed to bore into you. His clothes were worn, like he didn't care how he looked, and he had this quiet, unsettling confidence. Nobody said anything to him, though. Nobody wanted to cause a scene. I caught him staring at Madison from across the room. She didn't notice. She was busy laughing with her boyfriend, Nate. The way Jake watched her made my stomach twist. By midnight, people had started to trickle out. Madison, ever the gracious host, was busy saying goodbye to groups on the porch, while Nate cleaned up the mess in the kitchen. I was upstairs with Jordan and Becca, sitting on the bed in Madison's room, talking about college and what came next. Then, from somewhere downstairs came a loud crash. The three of us froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Jordan muttered something about drunk idiots breaking furniture, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We crept downstairs, stepping carefully to avoid the creaky spots on the stairs. The living room was empty, the music still playing softly from the porch. "Hello?" Jordan called out, his voice trembling just slightly. No response. Then a muffled scream came from the kitchen. We ran, nearly tripping over each other in the dark. When we got there, Nate was on the floor, blood dripping from his head. Madison was nowhere to be seen. "What the hell happened?" Becca screamed, dropping to her knees next to Nate. He groaned, struggling to sit up. "It was Jake. He came out of nowhere, took her." "Took her where?" Jordan demanded, panic creeping into his voice. Nate pointed toward the back door, which led to the sprawling, pitch-black woods behind the house. Without thinking, we grabbed flashlights from the mudroom and ran outside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to block out the moonlight. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst open. We followed a trail of broken branches and disturbed grass deeper into the woods. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it. A faint light flickering through the trees. We approached cautiously, the beams from our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The light was coming from an old hunting cabin, the kind you'd expect to see in some slasher movie. Inside, we could hear voices, Madison's panicked and pleading, and Jake's low and menacing. Jordan pushed the door open, and what we saw will haunt me forever. Madison was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face streaked with tears. Jake stood behind her, holding a knife, his eyes wild and a face twisted into a grin. "You shouldn't have come here," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with menace. "Let her go," Jordan said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Jake laughed, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? None of you do. You all think you're so much better than me, smarter, more deserving. But tonight, I'm the one in control." He stepped closer to Madison, pressing the knife to her throat. Before I could think, I grabbed a heavy stick from the floor and swung it as hard as I could. It connected with Jake's arm, and the knife clattered to the ground. Jordan and Becca lunged at him, wrestling him to the floor. He fought back, his strength terrifying. We managed to hold him down until Nate and a few others arrived, drawn by the commotion. The police showed up not too long after. Jake was arrested, and Madison was safe, though still shaken up. I'll never forget the look in Jake's eyes as they dragged him away. Empty, as though he'd already accepted his fate for whatever was coming next. That night changed everything. We didn't talk about the party much after that. It wasn't the kind of memory you wanted to relive. But every time I drive past the woods on Ridgewood Lane, I feel that same chill crawl up my spine. And I can't help but wonder if Jake's still out there, waiting for his chance to finish what we started.